everyone, and welcome back to the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome podcast, sharing research, progress, and hope. This episode, we will be meeting our 2024 grant awardees for the Shannon Memorial Neuropsychiatric Illness Grant. We are lucky to have both Tess Levy, an assistant professor of psychiatry and clinical trials manager at Seaver Autism Center at Mount Sinai, and Pilar Trelles, the Associate Chief of Outpatient Psychiatry Service at Boston Children's Hospital. Their funded grant is called Adapting PIPs for Progress, Development and Validation of an Ecological Momentary Assessment Tool to Enhance Psychiatric Symptoms, Monitoring and Intervention Response in Phelan-McDermid Syndrome. Whew, that's a mouthful. All right, well, I can't wait to hear more about it. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, thanks.
Neither of you are strangers to the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation community, but could you share with our families a little bit more about kind of your background and then how you found your way into Phelan-McDermid Syndrome research?
My name is Tess. I did both my undergraduate and graduate training at McGill University, which is in Montreal. And then I moved to New York, originally to work part in clinic and part in research in undiagnosed genetic disorders, mainly in neurology. And then shortly after, I moved over to the Seaver Autism Center, which I've been at for now like 6 years, which is pretty wild. And the Seaver Autism Center had already been studying Phelan-McDermid Syndrome for probably a decade when I got here. But it's the largest rare disease program that we have. And I just kind of fell into all of the research and made myself kind of a role that focused in PMS within Seaver.
I am a child psychiatrist. I am originally from Peru, but I've been in the US for 20 years, which is a very long time. I arrived at Sinai for my fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry, and I always had an interest in working with children with atypical developmental trajectories. And as part of my work at Sinai, I met the team at Seaver, where I started to get additional exposure and experience, and that was probably at that time. 2014, 2015, when I met the first patient with Phelan-McDermid. And then after my fellowship, I stayed to do a postdoc where I got a lot more of exposure. And, over the years, I've come to meet, dozens, if not more, families with Phelan. One of the things that I've been kind of involved to some extent mostly from a clinical perspective, has been, the emergence of neuropsychiatric symptoms very early on when we started to realize that this was a significant issue in the population. And as part of that, I was, kind of at the beginning in the Echo Neuroconsultation group, where I've, been lucky enough to work with amazing clinicians, truly, literally all over the world, and then, kind of hear about so many families and their stories. Tess and I kind of team up early on. She was a light that walked into Seaver with, lots of amazing ideas and knowledge that, I didn't have. So it was really wonderful to kind of team up and, over the years, just kind of think about how can we, make treatments more accessible from our little corner of the world. And that's how, the idea for this project, was born.
I know you guys consider yourself maybe a little corner of the world, but in the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome world, you're kind of a big deal. A lot of families know and recognize you. And we'll probably get into maybe a little bit more of the ECHO group a little bit later on. But as you're pointing out, you guys did receive the Shannon Memorial Neuropsychiatric Illness Grant. So congratulations again. And share a little bit more about what the project aims to do.
So the overall purpose is to create an outcome measure that's measuring psychiatric symptoms for individuals with PMS. The purpose really is to be able to use this to measure change over time, so as part of a clinical trial or just as part of clinical care. And so we created like an iterative process where we are going to start with a form called the PIPS that Alex Collison and Tacey Kohlenberg created, rather than starting all new again. And we're going to use this form, and we get feedback from different sources, from caregivers, from clinicians, more caregivers, more clinicians, and then we adapt it at each stage, hopefully to create an outcome measure that resonates both with the caregivers, but also provides a strong tool to measure change over time.
I think one, to add to what Tess said, one important aspect of the grant and something that we've learned in this process is, being able to capture the lived experience of families and what it means in the day-to-day life for them, and making sure that, as what we're kind of perceiving as clinicians is relatable to them, but then also making sure we're capturing the things that are more impactful to their lives. So we're really trying to incorporate their voices in the adaptation of this instrument.
I love that. And I'm sure the families listening also love that. And that was a really big theme of our previous podcast with our other grant awardee, Dr. Christy Johnson, of how important that stakeholder feedback with those with lived experiences really shapes the process. Not to spoil anything for our listeners, but I know you guys have sort of had to extend and modify a little bit of the process based upon that feedback that you guys have received. And that's amazing that you're sort of so flexible with what you started with and really saw a different direction to go. And so with this outcome measure for neuropsychiatric illness, can you give us a little bit of an idea of what types of behaviors or symptoms you're trying to capture specifically?
Yes. So I think one of the challenges that we have in psychiatry is that we really rely a lot on behavioral observations, and descriptions of these behavioral observations to capture symptoms. In the case of neuropsychiatric symptoms, we are trying to look at things as like mood and sleep and energy. Someone's ability to get through their day, if they've, how much they have changed from their baseline. What are the things that are truly getting them in trouble, not just like the stuff that they have lost, but if there's anything that they might be doing like more impulsively. So is it all of a sudden that they don't want to leave the home, so they are unable to participate of their programs, or they are kind of running away from their families? Are they spending a lot of time kind of moving around? Are they doing it with any sort of intentionality, or this is kind of very disorganized? All of these different things have a lot of commonality in the symptoms, in the way they can present. So you can talk about someone being irritable, and depending on the context of the other symptoms, that irritability might mean many things. It could be that they are manic, it could be that they are depressed, it could be that maybe they're hearing voices. So the idea of the instrument is to capture symptoms in a way that is meaningful to this set of symptoms, which is what happened to many of these individuals as they get older, that they develop these complex symptoms that look a little bit like kind of bipolar-like illness in some ways, and catatonia, and there's significant loss of skill for a number of them. So capturing that, finding the best language to make sure we are capturing it, and finding how do we ground those symptoms so we actually identify what are the best diagnostic categories for them.
One of the other challenges that we've had in adapting some of the questions. So the PIPS was originally designed based off the DSM, which is how these different conditions or symptoms are diagnosed. And those are mainly written in terms of people who can express themselves or answer questions directly. So the first version of this form already adapted it so it would be relevant to kids with intellectual and developmental delays. But now we wanted to kind of ensure that it also captured the whole range of the PMS spectrum, which everyone also knows is pretty wide. So we're adapting each of the questions to make sure that the behaviors we're trying to captures how that behavior can look in a kid who's nonverbal, and then in a kid who does have speech. So there will be a lot of examples on each question people will see, which we hope captures the full range of PMS.
I really appreciate that that is something that has come out, since I know, especially for neuropsych illness, and especially kind of when things maybe progress to catatonia, that's one of the harder parts for parents and clinicians of really comparing it to that baseline.
And part of the limitation that we have, and this is true in general in Phelan-McDermid and in other conditions that impact neurodevelopment significantly, is that many of the instruments we have really do not even capture all of the abilities they have.
Mm-hmm.
So, we get, unfortunately, we've gotten stuck with these empirical instruments, these, instruments that quote unquote have evidence that then, as I'm sure you've discussed with, many of the parents listening are aware, that really do not, necessarily match what their children can do. But then because they're not capturing what they can do at baseline, then how can you measure that change over time? And hopefully, our hope is that by engaging in this process, we can create something that is more specific and meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was definitely something kind of in the last podcast too, is really making sure that initial ground truth of where that child or adult is typically, and what skills they do have, and then what loss that those parents or caregivers are seeing are kind of meaningful and different for each family. So where are you with the project right now?
We have completed the first aim of our project, one of 3. For this aim, we met with 2 caregiver groups. I think it was 10 caregivers in total, and then with our expert clinician group. And all of these meetings, the purpose was to get feedback on each of the items, but also on the overall form to see if we missed anything was repetitive. And as you mentioned before, we actually received so much constructive feedback. The form is very, very different, and we are going to reverse a little bit and collect new pilot data. So we have completed aim 1. We're going to take a quick detour, and then we'll be back to aim 2, where we will build the new form into this new application, and then caregivers will complete it on the application to give feedback on how this application works, the ease of it, the format of it, and again, to get feedback on the content and the questions.
Perfect. And, we always love to do recruitment plugs here. At what point along the way can some of our listeners join in, help?
Very soon.
Wonderful. Did want to bring up that, one of the things that has been so important for your project and some of the other projects we've been talking about is really this stakeholder informed or community engaged research. And it seems just more important now than ever, especially within rare disorders like Phelan-McDermid. And we talk a lot about the benefits of it and how amazing it is, but I do also want to make sure for the researchers out here, we are also talking about maybe some of the challenges associated with this work.
A lot of the work that I've tried to do over the years has been around incorporating parents' voices. It can be a little bit of an uphill, I think, at the beginning, because you need, in general, to build relationships. And truly, a lot of what this process is around something as relationship building, where there's a lot of openness and mutual respect and understanding of common goals and where you're going. I think with the families in Phelan-McDermid, a lot of that kind of exists already through the foundation and the work that has happened over the years. I think that part, which can be harder, is kind of already there. So it's been kind of for us to harvest. And it's been in so many ways like really meaningful. I think in one of our first parent group, one of the moms said, just reading this form and, these are all the things that I've been trying to tell my doctors. And not having the language to communicate what I'm seeing home, and then having all of these ideas to be able to put it in perspective and, kind of be able to even communicate better, and just realizing that we have so much to kind of share with each other. And then, things that we are not, questions that, were written in a particular way and didn't make sense for families or felt repetitive in some ways. And, coming from the clinical world, sometimes you're not reflecting in those things. As a clinician, if a parent tells me, my child is not sleeping, I will ask a number of questions and I know exactly what I'm looking for. And then I kind of integrate it into my clinical assessment, right? So it could be, am I looking for, they're not sleeping well? Are they like up all night? And the quality of that poor sleep will tell me a lot about what might be going on. I think in a conversation that might be lost, that might kind of happen organically. And then when we have this questionnaire, we might be asking those same questions. But then for the parent that is asking it without the clinician at the other side, it might just feel like, what is this question? Where is this question coming from? What does it mean? So truly, knowing when those questions need like examples, need more descriptives, which might be like redundant, can we ground, what we're trying to look for, right? Like how many questions about sleep do we need? How many should we take off? And if we take any off, what are other questions that we might need to be asking? I think it's that like being in the middle of this negotiation between like the experts and what it's expected from the field, and we want to get this to the FDA, and what is approved, and making something that is meaningful and can be used in research and etc. And then what kind of the parents are reflecting of what is their day-to-day experience, what is feasible for them to do. And I think more of that, just being in the middle of that and being able to translate could be, if you would call it, kind of the challenge and balancing that out.
Tess, anything you wanted to add there, or any other additional challenges that come to mind?
I think, the caregiver groups and the clinician groups have been so wonderful that really nothing in that point has been a challenge. I think for me, the biggest challenge so far is the kind of balance between what both the caregivers and the clinicians say versus what the FDA wants to see in an outcome measure. So they very much don't like proxy measures, which is where a caregiver can answer on behalf of the patient. But they do allow observed behaviors. And so any of the items that had any emotion in them or anything that a caregiver would infer for their child, even if we think, and the caregiver and the clinician all think that a parent could see when their child is sad or when their child is another emotion, the FDA doesn't let us do that. And so we're having to change all of these emotions into behaviors. But sometimes we can then end up with 7 different examples that really just mean, is your kid sad? And we just can't ask that. So we've had a challenge of kind of doing what the FDA wants, but then making sure that the questions make sense and aren't too wordy. And so that's been the biggest challenge, I think, so far.
It's a really important point that you bring up, and probably not something that we've talked about here maybe much, and our parents are really thinking about, is not only do you talk about the negotiation sort of between what the researcher and clinicians and the parents sort of need, but then you have this whole entity of the FDA and this idea that they really aren't a fan of proxy reported emotions. And, I've seen this come up in other rare diseases that I've worked with. And so I think neuropsychiatric illness is another unfortunate example of this, where you do have so many changes in these affective emotional states, and now you're having to rely on behaviors. And then it adds burden to the parents and the clinicians, because now you're answering 10 questions instead of 1 or 2.
And we think will be what a parent would describe of their child being sad, but you might be missing something, right? And sadness is probably like an easy one in some ways. There are others, which is like irritability or like a lot of energy, and how do you describe it in a way that it's truly captures that change. One of the things that has been kind of important that came from the parent groups, what was the child's or the individual baseline before any of the symptoms were developed, and then kind of the baseline on day 1, like the day that you are completing the form. So that's also kind of allowing us to make sure that we are actually measuring those symptoms, even if we cannot talk about the behavior and there's a change.
Right. So once this project is wrapped up, where can our families and community expect to see results?
We certainly plan to publish all of it. I think also the form will be publicly available once we complete that. Definitely at the PMSF conference, which will be next July.
And through, adding to kind of its clinical utility, because I think we obviously, a big component of this is developing an outcome measure that we can use in clinical trials, which is so important to advance the science. And at the same time, we need to kind of be mindful of what families are going through now while the science advances. So having something that will inform clinical practice, and that would be through the neuroconsultation group, the PMS ECHO.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great point of there's sort of these these different kind of pillars working through both the FDA clinical trial, but then just sort of the everyday practical use. Some of our families are lucky enough to get their care out of Boston Children's or Mount Sinai, but the vast majority of our patients are somewhere else in this country or somewhere else in the world. And so having a standardized measure for neuropsychiatric illness is really going to kind of help that common language between physicians, families, providers. So I think that's one of the more exciting things about this work is sort of that everyday practical use is going to be really important.
Yeah, we had a few caregivers in our group even mention that they wanted to track their child's symptoms over time, and with a new medication, they wanted to track it. And they had all these notes about different symptoms and different behaviors and how they looked physically that they were trying to track. And it would be really nice if they had a form that they could use just to track it themselves, even if they weren't part of a clinical trial, to have some kind of idea of if the medication is working for their child, if they seem to be getting better over time. And so at least what they expressed to us so far is that it would also just be useful in their everyday life.
Right. Absolutely. Sort of, oh gosh, now looking over the past, weeks of data, something's really changing. I need to talk to the doctor, or wow, like things have been improving. I am sometimes so surprised. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And so seeing some families, like some families will bring out those binders of like behavior charts and things. And I'm sometimes so impressed of like, oh, wow, you are a scientist in itself. Maybe a little bit outside of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome world is that neuropsychiatric illness, catatonia, some of this later regression is not specific to Phelan-McDermid Syndrome. As we're recording this, there's been a group that is doing that catatonia webinar that we're co-sponsoring. And so there's lots of different rare diseases that are a part of that. And so, it would also be nice whether this form or an adapted version of this form, I'm sure will be really useful for the broader rare disease community as well.
Yeah, Tess and I recently finished, along with other clinicians, a review on catatonia, and went through all of the papers we could find and case reports in a number of genetic syndromes, and truly is, it's kind of universal, and it's a sign of brain pathophysiology, or severe brain pathophysiology. So I think having better ways to measure it is so critical.
Right, absolutely. And something like this is also going to really tell us, is there something specific about the symptoms or the course that are specific to Phelan-McDermid syndrome, or what parts are sort of overlapping and kind of universal across some of these rare disorders to really then be able to pinpoint some treatments or mechanisms.
Yeah. One of the things that, seeing a lot of kids with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, we kind of know what treatments tend to help. And obviously there's, lorazepam, which is Ativan, which is what you use kind of to treat catatonia broadly in terms of medications. This is kind of oversimplifying it. But we find that medications that are used for epilepsy or mood stabilizing agents like lamotrigine or Depakote can be extremely helpful. But going to your point, I think it's about helping kind of our families here. But then what we are also learning that can help other families that might not have a quote unquote parent disorder, but the presentation behaves very similarly.
Right, exactly. And I, can only imagine the families here who have had that lived experience of experiencing one of their child have a neuropsychiatric illness. They would never want any other family to go through that. So as much as your guys' work can inform sort of this broader neuropsychiatric catatonia community, I'm sure they'd be happy to. So we've touched a little bit about this already with Pilar's participation in the Neuropsychiatric Consultation Group, or the ECHO. What else are you guys doing in the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome field? I mean, I feel like a little silly asking that because I think our parents know both of you, especially Tess, really well. But here's a time to humble brag and to share some of your other work.
Well, I am still very happily taking part in the first 100 Days program through the PMSF, offering genetic counseling to either recently diagnosed families or just recent families to the PMSF. Next week, I'm actually seeing my 100th patient through that program, which is really nice.
Congratulations!
Yeah, I know it's a milestone. But those have been great for me, at least, to meet all these families. So anyone new that wants to sign up, I would love to meet with anyone. And then all of the ongoing research at Seaver that we have in PMS, obviously, is another one.
Absolutely. And to get in with Tess, that would be an email to us at info@pmsf.org, and we will make sure that is in the show notes. Pilar, what do you want to brag about?
I see a number of patients clinically, and I get referrals all the time. I think because I speak Spanish, I get all the time like emails and questions from people in other countries that are Spanish-speaking countries, and there's a lot of them. Yeah, but in terms of research, we kind of have this project. I collaborate with the Translational Neuroscience Center at Boston Children's, and they have some projects going on there, and I've been of support. And then really what we are doing clinically. And, we're trying to really be able to set ourselves better to support many of these families in kind of the clinical space, which I think is, very important.
Right. Those boots on the ground are just as important as kind of the research behind the show too. So before I let you go, anything else you want to share with the PMSF community and our families who are tuning in?
Sincere thank you to everyone. I think, the families that have shared their time and that we hope will share their time now by answering the form is really invaluable. We find it very meaningful when, families are willing to kind of get out of the way and share their stories and trust with us. And we truly try to incorporate it in a way that can inform research and better clinical care.
And also a thank you to the PMSF. I know it takes more administrative work, but allowing a multi-site study so that Pilar and I could do this together is incredible. And I think it's going to be a great project and hopefully come out really well. Also that it's just a very big honor to be doing this in Shannon's name. And we're very grateful overall of the award and the grant and the creation of it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure her family would love to hear that. It's just sort of happens to be the right time where we just a couple weeks ago got all of our applications for the next round of the Shannon O'Boyle Neuropsychiatric Grant. So our scientists have received their applications to review. Families will be receiving them soon. And so we're excited to kind of mention that to our community a little bit more broadly. And again, we can't, these grants aren't possible without the support from our families and communities making donations. This is really important to keep the science going. And especially now more than ever, where federal dollars aren't necessarily as guaranteed. Foundation grants like this are going to be really important to get projects off the ground. So thank you again for kind of the community who have helped donate, and we're always seeking more donations. Well, thank you so much, you two. You guys have such an exciting project, and we are so grateful for everything you have done for the PMSF community. I know our families and the friends that are tuning in are just as excited as I am to see where this goes. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we have a measure we can share with everyone at some point. So again, thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye.